change in the fundraising sector has never been greater. But innovations in technology are evolving faster than our ability to understand them. Are these advances good or bad? Do they have unintended consequences? And what is the application to the global fundraising sector? That's what we're here to find out. Welcome to the Fundraising AI Podcast, your up-to-date resource for responsible AI for the global fundraising community, hosted by Nathan Chappell and Scott Rosenkrantz.
All right, here we are at another episode of the Fundraising AI Podcast. Off to a great start as I ended a recording before I began. You can tell how excited I am today. No, truly, I am really, really excited. I am here with one of my favorite people in the entire world, someone that has been on this podcast before, someone that I've known for many years, and we've just had a blast, I think, in the sector doing a lot of cool things. So I'm here with Kelly Hecht from AWS, and just a dear friend of mine, and I think one of the most endearing, most strategic thinkers that we have in our sector. Kelly, welcome to episode 35 of the Fundraising AI Podcast.
Ooh, 35. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. You always make me blush when you introduce me, but the feeling is mutual. I think when I talk to people about their careers and what they want to do next or first, I always say, find people you like to work with. It's the most important thing. And you are that person for me. I love getting to work with you. We've worked together in lots of different ways and roles, and I'm super excited for today's conversation.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for carving out the time, Kelly, today. Today is going to be a little bit, actually, I think a lot of it different episode. That's not correct grammar, but it's a lot of it different episode in the sense that we're not going to talk about updates in AI. We're not going to talk about where Sam Altman is working this week. We're not going to talk about new models that are coming on the market today or tomorrow or the next day. We're going to talk about something that every person that's listening in has a great deal of experience with, and that is being human. And when you and I were texting back and forth of just kind of like this, what I consider bonus episode about being human, you're like one of the most human people I know. You live life to the fullest. You're happy generally, unless you're grouchy, but you're funny. You take things lightly. You really pride yourself on bringing people together. And so when we think about an episode on what it means to be human in an AI-centric world, you're like the top person on my list of like that really, I think, embraces the understanding between work and life and technology and humanness. And so that's why you're here. I don't know if I shared that with you before you agreed to step on, but that's what we're going to be talking about today.
You didn't. You also forgot the part of humanness that is, I get scared and I mess up all the time, and I have all of those sort of like fragile feelings in my world as well. It's I do not live an Instagrammable life. I live like a real gritty, complicated existence, which I think, to your point, is part of what you and I connect on, and is part of what is going to make this conversation so interesting, is that how AI shows up in the reality of life is both something really important to understand and think about, but also a little bit complicated and poses some questions that not everyone's ready or interested in thinking through. So hopefully today we'll start some of that for some folks.
Yeah. And the other part is that we want to make this a conversation, not an interview. Although we know what happens if we make it an interview is that you end up interviewing me, and then it's just weird and awkward, and we don't know who's actually going to close the episode and all that. So this is truly a conversation between...
Go ahead.
This is a conversation between two friends about what it means to be human, to do human in a AI-centric world. And so this is a conversation that I'm becoming more concerned about, increasingly conscious of. I don't know if you have as well, in this idea that AI promises to give us this dividend of time, that it's about creating efficiency, right? Either helping us do things that we couldn't do before, or helping us do things we did before, but doing them faster. And I think it's one of those things that if we're not conscious about, and we're not deliberate in hitting pause and kind of assessing periodically, that we end up on this hamster wheel that just goes faster. And maybe it's because I sense this for myself, that I'm doing more than I've ever done before. I feel like the hamster wheel is like maybe 10, 20% up. And I don't know if it's just a direct response to AI, but I think it is. Like I actually find myself producing more, expressing more creativity too, and frankly, publishing more things that I wouldn't have done otherwise. but it's almost like I have to hit pause, and I have to be deliberate about doing that because I could see it just like the dial is just slowly going up and up and up. Do you feel any of this tension, or are you just like, no, you're a much more evolved human than I am,
No.
and you saw this coming and you're just dialing it back down as the temptation is that for it to increase?
I mean, do I feel it like palpably all day, every day as
Mm,
an employee, as a mom, as a friend, as a person trying to figure out what it means to live life in the way that I want to live it? Yes. Do I think it's AI infused? No. I think it started quite some time ago with some of the more early evolutions of technology. And I do think that AI is the current flavor du jour, if you will, of what has created a pace of life that continues to feel like someone's pushing up on the treadmill, and you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was okay at that pace for a minute, but now it's going too fast, and by the way, I don't actually know when it's going to pause. But I think hopefully some of the past experiences we've had will create a little bit of a roadmap for us. And candidly, there's a ton of research out now on the effects of certain types of technological innovations that have taken place, namely like cell
mm,
phones and our
mhm.
attention span and our mental health and teens and all that, right? So I think there is some information out there that we would be wise to borrow from and think about how it relates to the choices that we're making with today's most relevant innovation, which are different forms of AI and in particular the generative AI space.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we've been on the hamster wheel for a while, right? And when I do one of my keynotes, I talk a lot about the competition for connection,
Hmm.
and where 15 years ago, the average person interacted with about 300 algorithms per day. By next year, that will be 5,000 algorithms. That has nothing to do with AI. I mean, a lot of those algorithms are AI infused
Right.
algorithms, but it's the fact that the world has gotten much smaller in so many ways, right? From even when I went to undergrad, we talked about the global economy, but in kind of like futuristic terms. And now everything is global, everything is interconnected from
Everything.
every purchase you make in the entire world. And we know this because when COVID happened, the toilet paper fiasco of the world happened because somehow like the trees that were being milled, whatever, and the drivers and the rubber from their tires, I couldn't get whatever it was. It's like everything is so interconnected that it maybe is just more of the same or just a bit more exponential in AI. I will say that for me, AI does allow me to produce more. And I have this like internal battle where it's like,
Mm.
now that I can do something, I have to consciously decide, should I? And not that it's a good or bad decision. It's just like, it's another decision. It's another thing. And as someone who is a self diagnosed overachiever that suffers dramatically with boundaries, I have this constant tension of not doing enough, or the constant tension
Yeah.
of like I need to do more because I had an idea, I can activate that idea with AI. So I think I live in more guilt now, in the self guilt of like not doing something. Do you suffer with it at all, or you? I mean, is it because you're more objective in life and dealing with other things in life that keep you from living in
I don't think
that
it's that.
spiral?
I think there's two things. One is I find myself as I'm listening to you talk, think about like, is some of our experience a result of our maturity in using AI? Like you are a much more avid user. You have more depth of understanding of it in many different facets than I do. I would say that like on the spectrum of adoption, you're on the mature front, right? Where I'm probably more on the like emerging front, right? So some of it could be just where we are in our journey of utilizing AI. For
Hmm,
me, I
that's a
find
good point.
that the tension I feel around information and access is less stimulated by AI right this minute and more around the information overload. Like, I think a lot about the news, for example. For the majority of my life, there were many, many parts of the world experiencing trauma and tragedy that I was unaware of, right? And good, bad, or otherwise, it didn't invest in my soul because I didn't know it was happening. And today, everything from a war that's happening to a celebrity interaction that's taken place to something serious, something trivial, everything in between, right? I feel like there is constant bombardment of information that affects my psyche, my mental health. That for me is driven by AI. To your point, all of those news outlets, all of those emails, all of my social media feed is all driven by different forms of AI. I don't necessarily connect those dots. Like, I don't think about my experience with those content sources, those alerts on my phone as being AI driven, but of course they are. So, on the flip side, for me, I think more about AI as it relates to how it's helping me achieve something more efficiently or more accurately pretty quickly, which I think is where you were going. And then I think where the question becomes interesting is for those of us that value accomplishment, that get sort of the dopamine hit from checking it off our list or delivering that thing that someone asks us to, right? And feeling satisfied and good about that contribution, then it's really hard not to want to engage with that all the time, right? Because if AI is allowing you to deliver more and have that delivery be better and faster and more accurate and all those different things, then you're like, you can feed that part of yourself. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's sort of what I grapple with is like to overshare. If I'm feeling really stressed at home about something, I will notice a tendency to want to like go sit down on my computer and do something because it feels satisfying to achieve it. I think AI feeds that part of our beings, which maybe I should sit and read a book, or maybe I should deal with whatever it is that's making me feel stressed at home, right? Maybe I should take a walk, but instead you can be drawn into that other aspect.
Yeah, I think that's so insightful. I'm having a lot of self-reflection here as I think back in my career, and there were times where I'd think about, well, what is my secret to succeeding in this job? And truly never been the smartest person in the room. I didn't have any like special gifts. I wasn't really good at any one thing. I was actually usually pretty good at a lot of different things, which I always thought was a weakness. But the one area that I felt that I could always beat others in a competitive environment was I could outpace them. And that was like my superpower. Like I could work with less sleep. I could literally just work harder and outpace other people. And I think that speaks to some of my upbringing. But with AI, that becomes kind of a kryptonite, to be honest, because now it's like this effervescent thing of like, I can just do more for you. Like let's do more together. I have this little AI thing on my shoulder of like, you had this idea, let's activate that idea. And I'm finding myself more and more needing to pull back and have the other AI on my shoulder be like, hey, wait a minute, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's not because it has like devastating consequences to humanity. It's because like, this isn't good for your soul.
Right.
Like the other AI on my shoulder is kind of like, go do something creative or read a book or go write a note to someone. And I think that's really the essence of this episode of just because we can doesn't mean we should. And when we do experience, and whether it's you're on the mature or the immature, even though that wasn't the word you used up and coming.
Immature.
I don't know.
I like it.
I definitely wasn't going to go there. Is that if you're beginning your AI journey, there'll be a time where more is just more. And I think to hit pause and for us to have conversations like this to say, how much is too much? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Like, how do we collectively know when to say no, individually and collectively know to say no? I think that's something that I really respect with you. And we've known each other for a number of years. And you're really good at saying, you know what, that's that and that can wait, but I'm going to go spend time with my family, or I'm going to go feed my soul out on this beach. And I know it's not easy all the time. And it's like, it takes effort to go do that. But every time I've seen you do it, you come back rejuvenated and refreshed. So I thought, like, why don't we just talk about like what it means to be human today? Like, what are things that you do that feed your soul? I'll share some of mine, and hopefully we'll hear from listeners too. And in the chat on the podcast of like, what are some tips and tricks to increase your humanness in an AI world?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you're right. I do prioritize things that are certainly not AI related, but also not work related or efficiency related or volume, if you take the more, right, more related.
Hmm.
And there are times where that's super hard, and there's times where I have to really force myself, and there's times, by the way, where I should force myself and I don't. There's a thing that comes to mind for me, which is intentionality. And I think about if you're taking anything, right? Driving, playing a game, food and beverage, work, everything that we intersect with benefits from us having intentionality around it, because every one of those aspects of our world, of our sort of pie, has the ability to take up too much or not enough. And the times where I feel the most grounded are the times where I'm really intentional in the sort of construct of my life and my pie and how big each slice is and
Mm.
why. So I think about that as it relates to AI. Like when I'm using AI, when I'm choosing to tap into it, whether it be for work or personal, I try to be intentional on a good day to think about what is the efficiency or the accuracy or the more that it's providing, and is that in fact the right use of it? And then to think about, okay, great, with that space it's creating, so that piece of pie just got smaller. Where am I reallocating that other pie? And by the way, sometimes I am creating efficiency with something at work so that I can go do another part of work. So it's not just like creating efficiency at work to be able to spend time with my kids. Sometimes it is like I have this really big project I need to take care of, but I have these other tasks that I really need to get done. And so I need to get these done faster, more accurately, more efficiently. How can AI help me do that? Because this requires my brain, my process, my thinking, my creativity, right? So I don't think it always has to be on the side of work and life, but I do think having intentionality prevents the inertia of more from getting away from us. Do you think with intentionality when you use it, or is it more just
Sure.
reactive at this point?
No, I need to. I've been thinking about what it means, like the inherently human traits that AI won't replace. And it's so interesting you're talking so much about intentionality. I mean, that requires consciousness of a situation and pros and cons and all of those, right? So I guess my follow-up question for you, and I'll talk about a word that I've been writing about recently, which is about curiosity. So I'm like really
Love
leaning
that
into
word.
that part. But the for you to, and again, I can learn a lot from this, and I think other people can too. To create intentionality means that you have to either be really wise, or you have to have a system or a process or some sort of way of creating the awareness, the consciousness around a situation to be intentional. Like,
Mhm.
is it do you is it just like how you were brought up, or is it that you wake up every day and you're like, I'm going to be faced with all these different things today and I want to be intentional today? Like, and I know this is like an evolving thing for
Yeah.
most people, but I'm just wondering if there's something to be unpacked there, because I think it's really powerful, that idea of like, I'm conscious of my surroundings and I have a choice. I want to be intentional with my choice. I just get sucked into the algorithms all day. And then at the end of the day, I'm freaking tired. I go to
Yeah.
bed and then I rinse and repeat the next day.
Yeah, and I don't feel good, right? It's almost like
Right.
eating like too much bad food, too much junk food. Like sometimes last night I got home and like I wasn't that hungry for dinner, but I wanted to eat something and I opened up my fridge and there's leftover pizza. I was like, I know I'm not going to feel good when I eat all that pizza, but guess what? It looks delicious. So
Yeah.
I think it's that. So one, was I born this way? Absolutely not. Always an evolution and still something that I don't know what the answer is for me. And whatever the answer is for me is not the answer for someone else. I will say I hit a crossroad probably 4 or 5 years ago with a lot of influence from multiple different sources around me, where I relaxed into a posture of not knowing, and which sort of aligns with your curiosity, right? And the posture
Mm.
of being not only willing but like actually loving to show up every day without certainty and without sometimes even clarity really unlocked a whole new side of life for me. So I think the curiosity that you're writing about is sort of the nugget of that. Like to get curious around where am
Mm,
I, first of all, where am I even using AI? To the first point of the conversation, like all the things I listed about the news feed and knowing what happens in the world, all of that is powered by AI. And that would not have been like my first
right.
answer when you said where to use AI every day. I think of it more like where do I pull up a browser and type in a prompt and get something out. So I think the first is to just start to be aware of where is it showing up? Where is AI present in your world? Which, by the way, I think pretty much is like everywhere right now. And then to start to think about where is it showing up that it feels like it's serving me well? I would say the doom scroll is
Hmm.
probably not serving you well, right? I heard a teenager this week say that his mom won't allow him to have the app, but he can go to the web version of something on his phone because it's just so much less user friendly that he spends less time on it. And I thought so interesting, right? Like something that doesn't serve you well, add some friction to using it. So I think figure out where it's showing up, figure out where it's serving you well, and then give yourself permission to get curious about like either if you want to go down the like psychological path of like why does that not serve me well, go down that path. If you want to go down the path of like it's not serving me well so I'm not going to use it, so what ways would serve me well, then go down that path. But I love the curiosity. It's super powerful and I find tends to like open really beautiful new doors.
Yeah, and the reason why I was led to curiosity, which it kind of stems from my earlier research in AI, which was that AI won't replace humans, but humans that use AI will replace those that don't. It kind of transcends and all those things. An earlier study, there's a book called AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, who ran Google China for a number of years, and he had this chart at one point. It was kind of this XY axis of like which humans or which jobs will be replaced by AI. And it was built on this idea around empathy and strategy. And if you had a job that was empathetic or if you had a job that required a lot of strategy, AI would not replace you. And sure enough, that we fast forward to the age of generative AI, that generative AI actually tends to be more empathetic than humans. It's also far more strategic than most humans. So, what we thought AI could do is very different than it is now. But by definition, if AI is told to be curious, it actually is not curious. It's just following instructions. So I'm kind of on this thing where I feel like curiosity is one of the last inherent human traits that AI by definition can't do. It can emulate it if it's told, but if you're told to be curious, are you actually being curious? I think matching these two things together, which is why I think you and I always have these just great, rich conversations of like, I could be curious to a fault, right? Because I'm like always the what if. I actually love to explore unfamiliar topics. I live okay in the gray. I get bored if I'm not. And that's actually how I cope with change. And I think I'm pretty good at coping with change because I'm always looking at like what's next. That can also be my Achilles heel because if I'm not even conscious of like, am I just going down more rabbit holes because I can, not because I have the encyclopedia of all the world's knowledge in my pocket, that's not going to serve me well because I'm just going to I'm going to become a hermit and just explore all the things in the world that I ever wanted to know. So I think there's this balance of like being curious to be an adaptable human in a very fast paced world and being okay with change. But I'm going to go back with you. I think you win on the intentionality because if you don't do this with intentionality, it just more becomes more.
Yeah.
So I think those are two really good tips for people listening in of like being okay with change because that's the world we live in and it's going to be continuing to evolve and change faster than ever. But creating boundaries around intentionality and maybe conscious checkpoints in your life, whether it's in the morning or the afternoon or before bed, to like assess, I think, if you will, like, how did I do?
Yeah.
Like, was I intentional about where the time I wanted to spend with family? Or was I intentional about the time I wanted to learn or even to be curious? So those are two really powerful human things that we just uncovered.
I mean, one, your curiosity, I think, I suspect you were born with it or found it at a very young age. I think I joined you later in life, but your curiosity, if you think back to like your early days in the sector, were what led you down the path all, 15 years ago to be curious about this new technology before it was even like in the vernacular of people in their day-to-day life. So I think your
Yeah,
curiosity.
it was called annoying, just to be clear. It
No, it
wasn't
was
ever
not.
called
No.
curiosity as a kid. It was just like it's annoying, but
That
thank
person
you.
needs to reframe their language. But I think it is a superpower of yours, right? And your curiosity. But I do think what's interesting is I admitted on the podcast we did earlier in the year around Imagine that I was like a nascent user. And that conversation that you and Scott and I had really stuck with me from the perspective that you guys kept saying, like, it's not about if, it's about when. And really what you need to do is just start using it. So I started using Perplexity at that point because Scott was like big fan. And I started using it in my personal life more than anything else. And and I will say I started using it for things that I didn't want to do, which I think comes back to sort of like,
Mhm.
where do you start and how do I blend intention and curiosity and work and personal? Like, I started with, if this is supposed to be an efficiency tool, right? And if this is supposed to be something that's everywhere, great, then I'm going to use it for the things I don't want to do, that stress me out, that take too
Right.
long, that annoy me, right? Any of those types of things. I think that advice came from Scott. Thank you, Scott. It was great advice. And that was sort of how I dipped into it. What I think is fascinating, and in particular for this conversation about being human and about where AI fits in our human experience, Mallory and I actually had a super interesting conversation where we had had a miscommunication without even realizing we had had a miscommunication that was driven around our perspective and our perception of the other person's use of AI. So she and I were
Mm.
trying to find time to meet, and we were emailing back and forth. And she dropped me an email and was like, here, just use my Calendly link. And I found it to be like the rudest thing. I was like, that's so rude. Like, why can you not just take the time to find a time that we can both meet? And so we were stuck in a car driving from a conference to an airport. We were stuck in traffic for 2 hours. And this came up. And I was like, yeah, I have to tell you, like, I actually like kind of like hurt my feelings. Like, why couldn't you just take the time to find a meeting? And in that like really Mallory way, she like stopped and she thought, and then she looked at me and she goes, I gotta tell you, my frame on that was so different. She was like, I thought I was really taking a lot of your valuable time trying to find this time for us to meet. And so I offered that to you to help, to like be thoughtful and respectful of your time. And I thought, isn't there like the most interesting real-time example of AI, good and bad, right? By the way, every time someone
Yeah.
sends me a Calendly link now, I'm like, isn't that thoughtful of them? They're just trying to help me be more thoughtful. But for a very long time, I had a different frame on it. So I share that because as we all experiment and as we all show up with intention, the curiosity is going to be foundational to everything we do, not just in how we use it and where we use it, but not to make assumptions in how other people are using it, to get curious around the intention of why. Like, let's imagine that someone brings you something that's AI generated that you think was like totally egregious. They should not have done that, right? As a manager or a leader, you could be like, that is so inappropriate. Why would you do that? You should have known better, right? Or you could stop and say, like, tell me a little bit about what led you to use AI to do that. Where did you start? How far did you get? Did this come up for you at all, right? So I think I hadn't thought about it until this conversation, but I think your curiosity is going to be super important to the evolution of how we as people and then we as industry leaders adopt, because there's a lot of room for misunderstanding in this space that I think we got to be careful around.
Yeah, and quickly evolving too. Yeah, it's something. I'll post a link to the LinkedIn article I wrote that I don't think many people have actually read. Anytime I write an article, it's like it makes me feel better by writing it, but then like you don't get all the likes and the things that you do because it's like
Oh.
it's an article, but it's really on
I'll
this
try to
idea
read
that
it. Did I read
curiosity
it?
is one thing.
Did I already read
I
it? I
don't
don't
know.
know.
At the end of the day, I'll put it in the chat and then you can read it. But
Okay.
it actually gives some really practical advice for both individuals to lean into curiosity. And if change doesn't come comfortably to you, there are things that you can do to get more comfortable with change by asking like what if questions
Right.
and exploring unfamiliar topics and doing some reflective thinking. But I have a separate section in the article for leaders and how leaders now, it's incumbent upon them to build a curious culture. And that curious culture, I 100% believe will outpace cultures that are not curious in a world that essentially evolves exponentially. So, kind of as we wrap up, I mean, I love having these conversations with you. They're always just so insightful. I know I'm already going to take away more on this. The part about intentionality is like I know it to be true. It's hard to do, and
So
it
hard.
takes actually it just doesn't happen by itself, right? It takes discipline to be intentional. So I think that's my takeaway. If I think about where the world is going, and essentially we'll have a decision to make as AI in all these things, right, creates efficiency. So like even Netflix using AI, it creates efficiency because I no longer have analysis paralysis. Maybe it takes me 5 minutes to figure out what I'm watching versus 20 minutes and lots of frustration, or maybe it takes me 30 seconds, whatever, depending on how good the AI is. But I think being intentional around this idea that when I'm faced with the opportunity to save time, and whether that's, say, a good example is like a doctor. A doctor sees a patient, and we know through medical science is that a doctor that spends more quality time with the patient has better outcomes. So it's
Yep.
not just the prescriptions, and it's not just the person who actually looks at someone in the eye, spends a little bit more time. If that doctor is able to offload 20% of their time to an AI note taker, which actually is proven to do a better job of actually more accurately taking notes and synthesizing conversation, what is the decision? Is the doctor see 20% more patients, or do they spend that 20% more time to improve the outcome? And I think as a human, every one of us will be faced with this idea is that if I'm going to save 20% of the time, my time, which I'm probably doing now using AI, am I spending that 20%? Am I being intentional about spending that 20% of more of my time talking with you, or writing a note, or doing something that's inherently human? And I think if we're not very, very intentional about that dividend of time, we will just get sucked into the vortex, and the hamster wheel will just get faster and faster.
Yeah, I think there's two like asterisks I would add to that. One is I don't know that the time we get back, the efficiency time, the what was the word you used? The time derivative, a
Time.
dividend,
Yeah.
has to be spent personally. Like, I don't think it has to be creative. I think like how you use that time is up to you. Again, if you want to use it to do more work, if you want to be the person that's just more work, great. As long as it's intentional that that's what you're trying to do, go for it.
Mm.
Like, how you use your time is yours. I think the other interesting thing that comes back to this concept of the humanity and the boundaries that we create, like there are times where an AI note taker is wholly appropriate. And I would also suggest that depending on what kind of doctor you are and depending on what kind of conversation you're having, there will be times where that probably wouldn't be appropriate. And so the intentionality also comes in not to set and forget. That as we think about some of these tools, as we think about some of these adaptations, like let's go back to Mallory and I, there might be a time, majority of which sending the Calendly link is the thoughtful thing to do. And then there might be times, like I'm trying to schedule time to have lunch with my 85-year-old aunt, where that would not be thoughtful. She would be so overwhelmed by that, she wouldn't know what to do, right? So I think the intentionality can show up constantly, and then we all get to sort of figure out what goodness looks like for us, and for you and me it'll be more of this.
Well, I hope so. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again for jumping on here, kind of as a last minute conversation on what it means to be human in an AI centric world. I mean, I know I'm walking away a better person, as I usually do when we have conversations, thinking through this. And I want to make sure that that I'm really going to reflect on this as I leave, and really think through, like, how do I create those systems in my life that cause me to pause for a little bit versus just say, yes, I can, or live in a constant state of like, I'm not keeping up kind of thing. So any last words, Kelly? It's great to have you here on as a repeat guest on the Fundraising AI podcast. I know this is going to be helpful for people listening in. Any last words of wisdom?
Thank you. And I can't wait to see what people write in the comments because I learn a lot from those too. So I can't wait to hear from people about sort of where they're getting curious and where they're bringing intention and how they're going to adapt in the way that they do both. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We will stay tuned for another episode of the Fundraising AI podcast next week. Actually interviewing Randy Fernando from the Center for Humane Technology on essentially understanding whether or not AI will serve humanity's best interest, which is a big topic that he'll be talking about at the Fundraising AI Global Summit on October 1st. So this will be a preview conversation for his quote unquote masterclass on October 1st. Can't wait for that. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.